Okay. So thoughts, reflections on this criterion of Thagad's, and I invite you to think about it, maybe in the context of the stuff by Dabholkar, or any other practice you might regard as pseudoscientific. So move the camera a bit. Anyone? So Hemant, why don't you? Sorry, not Hemant. Aditya, why don't you continue reading this to the end of the page, and we can talk a little bit more about what's going on.
Alright, sir. Progressiveness is a matter of the success of the theory in adding to its set of facts explained and problem solved. This principle captures, I believe, what is the most importantly unscientific about astrology. First, astrology is dramatically unprogressive in that it has changed little and has added nothing to its explanatory power since the time of Ptolemy. Second, problems such as the precision of equinoxes are outstanding. Third, there are alternative theories of personality and behavior available. One need not be an uncritical advocate for behaviors, Freudian or Gestalt theories to see that since the 19th century, psychological theories have been expanding to deal with many of the phenomena which astrology explains in terms of heavenly influences. The important point is not that any of these psychological theories is established or true, only that there are growing alternatives to a long static astrology. Fourth and finally, the community of astrologers is generally unconcerned with advancing astrology to deal with outstanding problems or evaluating the theory in relation to others. For these reasons, my criterion marks astrology as pseudoscientific.
Okay, so just pause there. So think about other things. We've not really discussed too many examples of things that might be called pseudoscientific in the Indian context. We only focused really on the case of superstition. But we have, well, how many of you have houses that are, I don't know, Vastu compliant? In Vastu Shastra. No, nobody.
Sumedha has told something about this in chat. In chat, yeah, what?
So my point is, this is not to make a substantive point about any particular candidate for science or pseudoscience, but to say that this is, at least to my mind, even though Thagard himself revised his view, quite a nice template. If there's a debate about pseudoscience, the debate does come across. I remember we discussed this thing from whatever. Did ancient Indians have aeroplanes, or is there is there an ancient Indian science of flying planes, stuff like that? Whenever, and a lot of this stuff, I find personally generates a lot more heat than light sometimes. And what I like about the Thagard kind of picture is that, well, it provides a very nice template to think through these things. Ask yourself, many people say, or the claim is made that, let's say, homeopathy is a pseudoscience. The claim is sometimes made, and not often in India, that Ayurveda is a pseudoscience. And Thagard's analysis is really less about the content of the theory, but upon, historically what's happened. Has it been less progressive than alternative theories over a long period of time? Does it face many unsolved problems? Does the community of practitioners make attempt to develop the theory towards solutions of the problems. One thing you find, at least, and I think this is true across the board, whenever there's that is not specific to India, but whenever there's a claim to, I don't know, some knowledge practices based on kind of the wisdom of the ancients, you might think that by itself kind of is a bit of a block, right? If you think that you already have everything, you already know everything already, well, then you may not be interested in looking for unsolved problems, and therefore you may not attempt to develop the theory towards solution of the problems. There's certainly something, this criterion of progressiveness, and a community of practitioners who see themselves as part of an ongoing refinement and conversation about their discipline or their theory, anchoring it or claiming that your reasons for the application of the theory are rooted sort of solely in ancient wisdom of one kind or another, that might come in the way of doing this. Does that make sense?
Can you repeat once again? I didn't listen clearly.
Oh, I was saying that if you take this criterion of the guards and you think about its application in this paragraph to the case of astrology, I was inviting you to think about that in the context of maybe often debates that happen in India about science and non-science and the scientific temper, debates that Dabolkar, amongst others, has been involved with. And I was saying that, so one of the things I'll invite you to do is think how different this kind of account is from the one that's offered by Dabolkar in that piece we read. But more than that, I was thinking that whenever you have a practice or a theory where the kind of claim to knowledge or the claim to why you should believe the theory is rooted in some fact about the distant past, right? Say, look, this is scriptural, this is the wisdom of the ancient rishis, or again, it doesn't have to be only in the classical Indian tradition. It could be in the context of any other tradition, including a biblical tradition. Whenever you say, look, the truth of these claims is rooted in something like firmly and deeply anchored in the past, it might then be difficult. I don't think it's impossible. It might then be difficult to have an outlook that involves looking for problems that are unsolved, or at least taking cognizance of things that your theory doesn't explain, and doing things to refine or develop your theory towards solution of the problems. Because you may have this orientation that, look, everything is already there. Our job is just to kind of elucidate it, but the theory is already presented in whatever text or that you're looking at. So that's the point I was trying to make, that this may in fact, so I don't know, I don't know enough about Vastu Shastra, for instance, to ask whether it is pseudoscientific or not. Though I must admit I have my doubts about Vastu Shastra, but in the absence of further research, it would be easy to just kind of scoff at it. But I feel like this would be actually quite a useful template if I wanted to know, or if you wanted to know, whether to believe in Vastu Shastra or to more accurately to regard that as a scientific enterprise, to look at, okay, what does the community of practitioners do? Has this this body of work, has it progressed over time? Are there things that 100 years ago Vastu couldn't account for that now, because of new work that the community has done, that it can now account for? These are kind of interesting, difficult historical questions to ask. Just picking up a textbook, I'm assuming that they're textbooks, so just looking at the content of the theory might not be enough for me to decide this question about whether it's should be classified as a science or not. I might have to look at the textbook from 100 years ago, or try and understand, look, what are the problems that it claimed to solve 100 years ago that it couldn't, and whether that's changed. Maybe all of those things are relevant to deciding whether or not to characterize it as a science or a pseudoscience. And that takeaway, this idea that he talks about this matrix, a demarcation criterion requires a matrix of 3 elements: theory, community, and historical context. That's I think, a very important point in general. It's not restricted to the demarcation of science and pseudoscience, but I think it holds lessons for critical thinking more generally. But before I say that, and that's the last thing I want to say for today, any questions in what I just said? Okay, so in that case, let me end with this last point I want to make, which is in the context of and I mentioned this before, but I've only touched upon it. The way in which critical thinking has been conceived in our course, and I think more generally in anything that people teach, is a kind of individualistic conception, right? You're being offered the tools for intellectual self-defense, to whatever, be a better citizen, or to protect yourself from being manipulated. And so now these are individual tools. I'm going to hand this tool to you, and then you go out and use it. But I think the part of what Haggard's reading should make us think about, and there are many reasons we should think about this, is that one shouldn't lose sight of the social, political, economic, these more collective conditions which might encourage or discourage critical thinking. So if you think about something like Chomsky, remember he talks about capitalism and the way in which, if you live in a world where you're exhausted by the end of the evening, then you're going to switch on the TV or look through social media rather than think hard about some political issue. But that's not the only kind of example. You might think, again, from the point of view of a community. There's a lot of conversation today about filter bubbles and polarization, where you're only talking to people who already have the same kinds of beliefs that you do. That may lead to a kind of dogmatism or unwillingness to question your own beliefs. So there might be, so it's worth thinking, if one cares about critical thinking, about what are the enabling conditions of community that are outside of not at the level of any particular individual, that might facilitate it, or it might come in the way of it, that and one can think of many. What is another way to use the word that we use often these days, what is the ecosystem in which that individual is in? And in many cases, in addition to these tools of intellectual self-defense, this list of arguments that you have, this way of identifying premises and conclusions, this way of thinking about language, all of that I've been teaching you and that these textbooks talk about, great. I'm not saying that they're not important, and why would I teach this course, or why would I teach this material if I thought they weren't important? But again, I want to stress that there's this whole world of, okay, look, what is the world you're living in? Are you living in a world where, let's say, there's freedom of speech, so that a whole bunch of alternative points of view is available to discuss? Are you living in a world where, let's say, media is independent and can criticize the government, or criticize, not even criticize, hold accountable people who make claims to um, and medical advancement in one way or the other? Are you living in a world where people have, um, education? Uh, these are kind of social facts, and those social facts may be much more important, or at least equally important for the development of critical thinking. Right? If you live in a world where, for instance, if it's possible to talk in a civil kind of way to people who disagree with you, well, that might automatically raise your game. This is the point I was making at the start of the lecture. But that's the point about the kind of society you live in, or the maybe in a more micro way, the um, particular ecosystem you occupy. It's not a point about kind of what's in your head in terms of your motivations and your your skill set, the kinds of skills we've been getting into. I think different societies have different norms over, well, how critically do you question things versus what you should, just try and believe. And I often think back to that again, that first reading that I had on the idea of epistemic well-being, and I mentioned this at that point also, right? You can think of well-being or health in a very individualistic kind of way. You can think, well, look, what are the tips for a good diet, or what's the best kind of exercise routine? How much sleep should you get every night? But only focusing, well, two things. One is being able to make choices around that may require, various social conditions to be in place. If the health advice is that you should be able to, do like an hour's worth of aerobic activity in the open air every day, well, that's only possible if you don't live in a very polluted city. Or if the health advice is don't eat food that has been treated with a lot of pesticide, well, that depends upon the availability of cheap food, or maybe not cheap, but affordable food that is pesticide free. Those things are not things that are up to an individual by themselves to do. I mean, many individuals coming together might make changes of that kind. And but in a way, because perhaps it's harder and harder to agitate for these collective sorts of reforms, and one feels like what's really under control is what we ourselves can do. I think it's easy to lose sight of the importance of these larger sorts of issues. It's true in the context of nutrition. It's true in the context of sleep. I mean, if the health advice is sleep 7 hours a day, and sleep in rooms with don't be exposed to too much blue light at night. I mean, people who are shift workers in the airport and who work the night shift, they don't have that possibility. So a kind of holistic model of public health would go beyond the advice it gives to particular individuals to do better, how they lead their own lives, but to take into account what are the social and political and economic conditions that make that possible. And I would say that's true for critical thinking as well. And again, what I like about the Thagard reading is that even though that's not his point, but he allows us to see how important that might be. So I'll stop here. Any further questions on these issues? You guys are a very quiet bunch today. Okay, so if there are no further questions, let's call it a day, and I will see you on Saturday. 4 p.m. is the tute and 5 p.m. is the class. And I think I'll actually have to, I'll post the reading only tonight, because I think I haven't brought my laptop with me and I'm at office right now. Okay then, see you guys on Saturday and happy Holi.
Thank you, sir. Happy Holi. Happy Holi.
Bye bye.
Bye.